Okay, welcome everybody in Ithaca and online. How is everybody doing this morning? It's still morning. There we go. Okay, can we have a little bit more enthusiasm? Yeah, excellent, wonderful. It is so great to see so many of you. Thank you all for coming, especially to our friends who came from afar, for making the drive on such a dreary, rainy morning. We are very excited to have all of you here today for an interactive session with Dr. Florencia Henshaw, who I will introduce in just a moment. So this event is sponsored by the Central New York Humanities Corridor from an award by the Mellon Foundation. And how do I advance? There we go. Oh, no, now I advanced too far. Here we go. So just to frame this real quick, the Central New York Humanities Corridor consists of 11 universities who collaborate on all sorts of different areas. The collaboration that we are here through is the Cultures and Languages Across the Curriculum Working Group, which consists currently of 4 institutions: Colgate, Cornell, Skidmore, and Syracuse. And we are very delighted that this interinstitutional collaboration is actually happening. It's wonderful that we get a chance to not only discuss amongst language colleagues within one institution, but actually connect with our colleagues from different institutions as well. So what we want to do real quick is a land acknowledgement here. This land acknowledgement is a first step in explicitly recognizing sovereignty and the ongoing history of dispossession of Indigenous peoples. Since location is core to our identity in name and in practice, the Central New York Humanities Corridor acknowledges with respect that our 11 institution consortium spans the ancestral lands and waterways of the Haudenosaunee people, Corridor participants take place on lands of the nations of the Sovereign Haudenosaunee Confederacy, founded at least 1,000 years ago at Onondaga Lake. Central New York remains home to the Haudenosaunee. We acknowledge the ongoing history of dispossession across the Confederacy and are grateful to live, work, and share ideas on these lands. So today we have Dr. Florencia Henshaw here, who will speak to us about guiding SLA principles and assessments, which is of course part of her recent book, Common Ground. Florencia Henshaw holds a PhD in second language acquisition and teacher education from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where she is now the director of advanced Spanish. She is an award-winning educator who has published and presented nationally and internationally on technology integration and research-based pedagogical practices. Dr. Henshaw is also the host of Unpacking Language Pedagogy, which is available as a podcast and on YouTube, where she summarizes and discusses research articles, activities, terms, and various topics related to language teaching. Her co-authored book, Common Ground, Second Language Acquisition Theory Goes to the Classroom, aims to help educators visualize how to put principles into action. So today she is here as part of our interinstitutional learning community, for which we are reading her book, Common Ground, right now. And we are focusing on the first section of this book, which is titled SLA and Pedagogy. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Florencia Henshaw.
Okay, thank you all very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here on a Saturday. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the LRC for the kind invitation. It is my honor to be here in Cornell. Can everybody hear me okay online? We're good? We're good, okay. Okay, so as Angelica said, so the title of my talk is Guiding SLA Principles and Assessment, which is essentially the first 2 chapters of Common Ground, although inevitably we are going to be talking about some concepts that appear later in the book. And that is a little bit on purpose because I taught the so-called methods course for several years. And one thing I noticed was that I was essentially doing what I didn't want to do in language teaching, which is I was covering, right? So we were covering one thing and moving on and moving on and moving on. So by the time we were done, it was a collection of all sorts of topics, but we never really started doing a lot of the recycling and connecting things. So one thing that I really wanted to do very intentionally throughout the book was to keep coming back to things, keep coming back to things. So today's agenda will be in 90 minutes, as best as I can. I always run out of time. So first, I do want to talk a little bit about the relationship between research and practice, because I think it's an important one, even though it's not discussed at length in the book. And then, yes, of course, we're going to talk about goals and assessment first. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of SLA, especially input and output. And the reason why in the book and in my talk, I do want to talk about goals and assessment before we jump into activities and all of that, is because if we're not on the same page when it comes to what we're trying to achieve, what our goals are and how we're measuring them, then the activities may not make sense, right, for what we want. So I think it's always important to talk about goals first. But let's clarify this relationship between research and practice. Do you agree or disagree with these statements? I'm going to show you 3 statements. So for each one, you can do hands. 1 is completely disagree. 5 is completely agree. And I think Zoom people can play along as well. So do you agree or disagree with this statement? Language teaching is unlike teaching anything else. What do we have? 3s, 5s, 4. 3 is the lowest I'm seeing. A 5, full 5. Okay, 4. Okay, does anybody want to see a 5 in Zoom? Thank you. So does anybody want to chime in why maybe you didn't give it a 5? What gave you pause? Yes.
I think that good teaching is based on students on any level. And so you could be teaching chemistry or Spanish, and if you're making connections, I think that's what prevented me.
I understand. I completely understand that, right? So there are some elements that are very unique to language teaching, but it's very true that some of the other considerations that we take into account are probably the same as other subjects and pedagogy in general. So if you give it a 5, why do you think it's so unique? Yes.
It's kind of little difficult to sort of put it in word, articulate it in that way, but it's just the way we have to cover different details of the language, and then the input and output, and the presentational mode, interpretive mode,
Yep.
interpersonal mode. All of those things are very, very hands-on approach, which is like almost like you are checking somebody every now and then. Like if they're making, it's like cooking, you know, and not, but also like cooking is like done and it's done. But
Right.
here it's very different. You have to work on different details, and which is probably hard to, like, it's kind of a little bit abstract to explain that in few words in
Right.
certain way. But just that experience, like I have experience, okay, if you're teaching somebody swimming, music, history, science, the approach is different. I mean, of course, there are certain things which are overlapping. Of course, there are overlapping, but overall, the way in which you have to sort of recycle, include,
Yeah.
you have to be walking through each experience of the student with them.
Yeah.
There is no separation, I feel. Like,
Yeah, I like that word that you said, experience, right? I think that's what makes it a little bit different. That I'm not an expert, obviously. I'm teaching other subjects. I did teach line dancing though, but that's a story for another day. But even teaching line dancing is very much, I'm going to explain it to you. I'm going to show it to you. You repeat it, you get it. And like almost like cooking, you say you're done with it, done, right? And language teaching, I wish it were that simple, right? And it's not. And I think it obviously that is a very simplified way of what has driven lots of research in SLA, which is the explicit, implicit knowledge, right? And whether there is an interface between them or not, and all of that. But essentially, it's that we're not just explaining language. We're not just showing them how language works, and then they go ahead and do it, right? We cannot do that with language. So I do believe that is very different from teaching anything else for sure. Now, I do also agree that some pedagogical considerations are the same for many other subjects, true. Okay, how about this statement? Some kind of focus on form is useful to some extent for some forms or some students at some point in the learning process. Okay, so this is probably like my favorite quote. Somebody said this. It was not me, but I think how beautiful it is because it shows you just about what we can conclude from research. This is a quote from Robert Kaiser, right? So yes, I think this is probably the only common ground that we can find. And it's very vague and it's for some at some point, right? And I think that's, I mean, maybe it's sad to hear it, but I think that's about all we can draw, the conclusion we can draw from a lot of this focus on form research. And that is because language acquisition is such an organic process that it's not going to work the same for every single student. That being said, it doesn't mean that just because it's such an organic individual process, it doesn't mean we don't know anything about it. So do whatever you want and hope for the best, right? So we cannot jump from one point to the next. There are some fundamentals that a lot of people agree on, and that was my focus on common ground. Okay, how about this one? Everything we do in the classroom should be justified by research findings. Ooh, two and a half, 3. Ooh, okay. We have the research crowd here. Okay, we are very divided. So I want to know why so low? And I even saw a straight no. Yes.
Well, I think that language teaching that there's a science to it, and I also think there's an art to it. And so I think that to be a good language teacher, research findings can definitely help a lot. But I also think that one's own experience in what you've observed as your own experience as a language learner and your own and just like your experience as a language teacher, I think is also important. And I think it's important to draw on your own, your own direct experience in what you've observed and to take in research, to take in information that you hear like completely externally, like from research sources. But I think it's important to also like meld that with your own direct experience that you have learned through working with real students.
Yes, absolutely. And let's be fair, there are real students in research as well, but every context is different, right? So you do have to adapt some of the findings to some extent to your context. Inevitably, I think you have to. I agree. I think probably this is why I saw a lot of 5s over here. It can tell us a lot, right? And sometimes it is very, very good to understand why we're doing what we're doing, to not rely entirely on sounds good, they're having fun, right? Not just rely entirely on very subjective perceptions and to have a more solid understanding of why. That being said, just because some research study tells you that something is wonderful, it may not work that wonderfully with your students, right? And that's something, I mean, we all have to acknowledge. So I think it's good to be informed, but then you're also informed of your own context and your own audience, right? Your students. I saw another hand up, maybe, yes.
Do 5.
Okay.
So a 5 or 1 or 3, and then I ended up with 3. I think research is super important. And I've done classroom research for language teaching and learning, but I think it's impossible to completely grasp what's happening in the classroom. When I was in teachers training in Germany a gazillion years ago, they told us within 45 minutes, you as an instructor have to do 500 decisions. You make 500 decisions within one lesson.
Wow.
How can I measure that scientifically? Right. So yeah, it's important, but I think we should also be aware that it never reflects completely what's happening in the classroom.
Right. Yes. So, and it may be shocked to see, and maybe Angelica's regretting inviting me by now, but yeah, no, I would say that no, not everything we do has to be informed. So I don't think everything we do, there's an art to it, there's also a science to it, but there's an art to it. But let's unpack a little bit more this relationship between research and practice. So according to Krashen in the 80s, so this has been something that obviously has been going on for a while, right? How much research should inform practice? So according to Krashen, the actual relationship between theory research and what happens in the classroom is almost like there's no relationship between anything, and that everything that is happening in language teaching is informed by intuition and ideas, right? That is what Krashen said. Don't throw anything at me. Okay, and then the ideal, according to Krashen, would be that teaching practice is informed by research, by theory, and also by intuitions and ideas. Now, I want to make some edits, and I know who am I to make edits to what Krashen said, but why not? So what I would probably edit is, instead of calling it a theory, I think what is happening in reality is that at least a lot of teachers are seeing a lot of seemingly conflicting theories, right? I think that linguistics research sometimes trickles down to practice, but not always, and sometimes gets sort of lost. Same with theories, the connection is a little bit unclear how much is informing it. And I do see a very strong connection between intuitions and what happens in the classroom. I think that is undeniable. And then based on what happens in the classroom, then that also feeds our own ideas and intuition. So I do see that as a two-way street. I think ideally, for me, what should happen is, I think we should all have a good grasp of some of the fundamental principles, as opposed to being so focused on every single theory out there. And then the other major edit that I would do is a two-way street between research and practice. So it's not always research-informed practice. It's always research-informed, research-informed, research-informed. At what point do we say teaching-informed research? Right? At what point do we flip it? Right? So I think that needs to be a two-way street. And I think it would help a lot with the communication, so it doesn't feel like it's one field telling the other field what to do, right? So it's not a one-way, but it's like a two-way infograph test. And then I think there's nothing wrong with ideas and intuitions informing some of our practice. I think also it would be really good if ideas are informing, intuitions are informing the kind of research that we do as well. But the part about fundamental principles really was a lot of what I wanted to do in Common Ground. So what I was noticing as I was teaching the methods course and working with instructors, working with teachers, K-12 teachers, what I noticed was a lot of this side, right? A lot of confusion, which was fueled by a lot of contradictions. And there are contradictions. I mean, ask any graduate student, every paper starts contradicting the other paper, right? That's what we do. And then what that happens is that when you feel confused, when you realize that people are just contradicting each other, then all you do is like, well, I'm just going to do what I've been doing, because this seems to be working for me, and so there's not a whole lot of change when that happens. So what I wanted to do by my main motivation for Common Ground was first and foremost clarity. Let's, declutter, try to distill the main ideas. Also make it as concrete as possible, understanding the kinds of questions that we have as practitioners in the classroom, understanding the kinds of things that are just fun to do in the classroom, and there's nothing wrong with that if we can justify it and connect it to what research says. And what I saw, and perhaps this is, I'm not bragging, I promise, but what I did see as I interacted with teachers is they felt like their competence, their knowledge of why they were doing what they're doing made them a lot more confident. So they were engaging more in these conversations. They were engaging more in creating, right? Because if you don't feel very secure in your knowledge, you kind of shut down, right? You're like, I'm just going to do my own thing, but I don't know. I don't want to talk to them because they know more than me. So the more you know, the more comfortable you feel having these conversations. And so to me, that was huge. And it kind of busted a myth that exists out there that teachers only want ready-made activities that they can do tomorrow. Some of them do. I do too. Be nice. But a lot of them want to know why. A lot of them want to be informed. So we need to stop with this division that research is only for the researchers, for the universities, and then we keep everybody outside, right? I wanted to make that connection a little bit clearer and more communication between everybody. So whenever somebody says I do research informed teaching. I always ask, what does that really mean? To me, research informed doesn't mean that I just follow everything that every single study has ever told me, but rather I'm collecting clues. And then I try to make sense of them in context, right? So you need some background information to understand research findings. And as the great Patsy Liebbaum said in the 80s, research is not telling teachers what to teach or how to teach. And this sometimes becomes the frustration of a lot of practitioners, right? As they don't relate to research because like, you're not telling me how to teach or what to teach because it was never meant to. It was never meant to, right? All research can do is this explanatory support for expectations of effectiveness. So if you're going to do something in class or not do something in class, that you at least have a good idea of the why is working or why is probably not going to work. So the one phrase I try to avoid as much as possible is the phrase research shows, because research can show you whatever you want, right? It can be a double-edged sword. The biggest research shows is this issue of teaching, right? Teaching explicit grammar or not, and teaching rules and not teaching rules, right? So the implicit and explicit contrast. And Catherine Dowdy unpacked all this and found that when we're looking at a lot of studies, right, that have focused on explicit and implicit treatments, what do you notice? What is the biggest chunk? Explicit treatment, explicit measure, right? And a very, very, very small wedge is implicit treatment, implicit measure. So the vast majority of them, right, the vast majority of them tend to do explicit testing, right? So how much they remember this particular thing, how much they can apply this particular rule. And so, yeah, research is entirely biased to show you the effectiveness of explicit instruction, right? Because that's what we're measuring. And this is why, some of the confusion then comes from, but wait, research shows that explicit is better. Well, it does because that's what we're measuring, right? So it always going to lead us that way. So instead of looking at just these research findings, and sometimes it's difficult, right? It's difficult to interpret them in context because you may not have all of the context, and there's nothing wrong with that. I always like to phrase things in a way that they can be accessible even to those who do not have a background in SLA, who do not have even interest in SLA research, but help them understand how maybe some of the basics of research. What I would say is probably like the analogy that I would give is, instead of just saying somebody, hey, this is my house, I'll leave the door open for you. No, invite them, show them around. Be honest about what works, what doesn't work, right? All of it. And phrase it in a way that you are marrying this art and science of teaching. And I like these 8 principles that Burns postulated in the 90s when people were arguing about the effectiveness of communicative language teaching. So Burns came up with these 8 principles, if you will, or these main things we need to keep in mind, the tenets, if you will, of communicative language teaching. I'll give you a minute to read them, and then tell me what patterns you notice across the 8 of them or most of them. What patterns do you notice?
For me, it seems like adjustments and flexibility.
Yes, variety, right? You see that pattern of variety. The first is this diversity, relative terms, not absolute terms, more than one variety of language, first and subsequent language, no single methodology. A lot of this variety, diversity, plural, right? You see a lot of that. Yes. Does anybody see any other patterns or anything else that caught your eye that you want to comment on? So the comment, I'm going to repeat just for Zoom, that you wish you had seen this the day you started teaching training. Yes, I think as it's beautifully written, right? It gives you a lot of food for thoughts. It's very clear. And I think that we can agree with a lot of these statements. What I like about this the most is that it is not about labels, right? It is not about good and wrong teaching, right? This is about some of the fundamentals that we can probably all agree on and reflect on as we make decisions in the classroom. Do you have any favorites? You do? No? Number 4, more than one variety of languages recognized. Yeah, as a viable model for learning and teaching. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Number 5, culture is recognized as an instrumental in shaping speakers' communicative competence. Absolutely. Yes. 6 is beautiful, right? If everybody follows 6, there'll be no arguments on Twitter, right? No single methodology of fix it is prescribed. Yes. Personally, I have a soft spot for number 8. I don't know why. It's just the way I work, from my brain works, right? I want them to do something, to have some kind of an application. And I think that sometimes that's what drives motivation too, right? Okay, so essentially what we've been talking about is a shift in priorities, right? And I try my best to avoid labels. I think proficiency-based teaching is probably the most broad of labels that a lot of people have been embracing. So I'm okay with that. Sadly, communicative language teaching became a little bit of a loaded term, and people associate certain things with communicative language teaching. So that's why I don't talk about it. But proficiency-based and communicative language teaching have a lot in common. When you think about it, they're pretty much the same. It's just a new name for it. So if you wanted to complete this table, right? The shifts in priority, how would you complete it? So for number 1, 2, and 3. So what shifts have we seen? So from the traditional being covering, what would you say is proficiency based? What is a priority of proficiency based? Competence driven, yeah, and communicative competence, right? Yes. So the priority has been on communicating, on communicative competence, much more than just covering the language, right? Yeah. What would you say for number 2? And we're open, you don't have to agree with the words that I have. So if proficiency based, so focused on meaning making, how would you describe the opposite, the traditional way? I cannot process all of that at once. I'm sorry, one at a time. Memorizing, yes. Repeating, yes. Very good. I have a mastering of forms, right? So it's very connected to what you're saying. Absolutely. And then if traditional instruction was a little bit of a compartmentalized view of language, right? That language is these bits that you learn one at a time, the irregular verbs and these type of verbs and these types of pronouns, right? Everything is compartmentalized. How would you describe proficiency based? Connected connections, yes, right? I would say maybe contextualized, right? Connected, I love that word. Yes, absolutely. So what we're seeing is just shifts in priorities. That doesn't mean that we are abandoning everything. It's just we are shifting what we are prioritizing. And to me, the biggest shift that I had to make, and it took me a while to make this shift, was to ask myself, what is my goal? And to go from the goal of correct use of structures and vocab to successful communication at their level. That was the biggest shift that I had to make, and that it took me a while to make this shift because I was so used to. We cover this vocab, I'm going to quiz you on the vocab. We cover the structure, I'm going to quiz you on the structure, right? Or you need to use the structure correctly, right? I was so stuck in that mode of looking at language and looking at language learning that it took a while for me to almost like take a step back, deep breath, and realize what is successful communication at their level. And this is really the base of proficiency-based instruction. We're aiming for successful communication at their level. And Sandra Savignon said it much more eloquently than I could ever say it. And I love this quote for many reasons. And it says, if the purpose of language study is language use, then the development of language proficiency should be guided and evaluated by the learner's ability to communicate. And there's several things I like about this quote. First, it starts with the if. Because I think that a lot of the times we get into arguments, and that's because we're imagining very different goals. And it's okay, right? But let's talk honestly about what our goals are, what we're trying to do. So if the goal is language use, and language use doesn't mean just talking, right? It doesn't mean just production. We're using language to understand. You're using your own linguistic system in English right now to understand me, right? So if it is language use, then the development of language proficiency, how we help them develop that, should be guided, right? So the things we take into consideration and evaluated by the learner's ability to communicate, right? So what is successful communication at their level? And as you know, Sandra Savignon was the proponent, if you will, the mother of, if you will, communicative competence. And for communicative competence, we have these three components: linguistic competence, strategic competence, and sociolinguistic competence. The one that I tend to focus in common ground, and then usually in my work, is the first one, which is linguistic competence, right? How do we help them build that linguistic system, have the language tools to understand, express meaning? That being said, there is a lot of strategic competence that goes into it, right? So for example, since we're talking about successful communication at their level, I do want them to figure out that if I'm asking them a question, it's okay if they don't remember the one specific vocab word that appeared on the textbook, but rather can they figure out a way of making themselves understood? And to me, that is successful communication. I'm not going to be taking points off because they didn't remember that one particular word, because that's how language works, right? If you're using language outside of the classroom and you don't remember a word, you find another way of expressing yourself and life goes on. So as much as I understand, respect, and I know how important it is to be teaching them words and for them to remember the words, of course, we also need to be flexible and not be punishing them for not memorizing the words, right? And then, of course, sociolinguistic competence comes from knowledge, yes, cultural knowledge, yes, but then it also has to come from experiences, right? This develops with time and we're having enough variety of experiences with different speakers of the language. So that one to me is the one that takes the longest probably to develop. So communicative goals, when I'm starting lesson planning, right? So how am I going to plan my goals? So the first thing that, of course, I want to keep in mind is that my goals are not about memorization or mastering of forms. That is not going to be my goal. Whether they need to be doing some remembering words to accomplish the goal later on, yes, but it's not my ultimate goal to see how many words they remember. The goals need to be attainable and measurable. They cannot be way too far from where we're starting. So I know that, books get published and books don't know your students, right? They don't know the level of the students, and books tend to move too fast, right? They tend to focus much more on covering. So I need to know my students and what do we realistically want them to be able to do from where we're starting to where we're going. And then goals tend to be task-based or function-based, or sometimes also overlapping with text-based. So if there's a particular text you want them to engage with, that is your sort of driving force, what it's based on. But some people do task-based, like my colleague Claudia Fernandez in UIC. So if we contrast these two examples of goals. Oh, Claudia Fernandez is on the chat. Look at that. I just mentioned her. Hey, Claudia. All right. It's too funny. All right. So if we contrast, she's saying hi. Okay. If we contrast these two sets of goals, what do you notice? Anything jumps out at you? Yes, right. So the focusing on the form, on the language itself, right, versus the function. I love that. Yes. So if you see in the first three, we're not saying which words, which structures we're focusing on. Of course, it's going to be words and structures that get us there. But then in this case, it's all about the language. What you use it for seems an afterthought, but it's all about the language. Why is this so important? Because to me, this has an effect on assessment and on instruction. Even if you don't want it to, it has an inevitable effect on assessment and instruction. If you start with the goal of use numbers from 1 to 99, inevitably your assessment and your instruction is going to be about, let's see how many they remember. Inevitable. You're not doing anything wrong. It's just your goal was that. But if you change the goal and it's write a review of a local restaurant, now it's harder to say, remember what exactly, right? And I think this is why it's so important to start with these communicative goals. If you don't have them or you cannot control them, I'm not judging you. I'm just saying, if you want to move towards proficiency-based, you need to have communicative goals to begin with. Because otherwise what you end up with is sort of looks like proficiency-based, but it's really still traditional, right, deep down. Where you're saying, well, but they're using numbers, they're using them, right? Isn't that communicative? And it's not really, right? Because you're still falling back to how many they remember, right? The memorization is still there. So you still have to go back to communication over memorization. Why? Because this is how we use language out in the real world. Yes, of course, we remember a lot of words and that's how we use them, but the main thing shouldn't be just to be remembering words. So what I have seen in my own experiences is a mismatch between instruction and assessment, which sometimes leads to some frustration. Which of these two cases of mismatch would you say, and there's no right or wrong answer here, which one would you say is more common? Is it when instruction is all communicative and then the assessment is very much accuracy-based? Or is it when instruction is very traditional, it's about practicing and mastering, but then the assessment is all communicative and proficiency-based? The first one, yes. So you know what has been fascinating, and somebody needs to do a research study on this. When I ask university people which one, they say the first one. When I ask K-12, they tell me the second one. So I don't know what's happening there, but something's happening there. So yes, me coming from university, the first one, no question, no doubt. That's our issue, right? Right now, is that in class is all about doing tasks and interacting and everything like that. And here comes the test. And see if they remember the word, don't forget the accent, right? Right? Usually at the university level, that's what we see. And now, why is that a potential problem? Because sometimes we reach the wrong conclusions, right? So if the mismatch is that the instruction is super communicative and the assessment is very traditional, what conclusions do we tend to reach? What problems do we encounter? Student anxiety. Yes, right, absolutely. So usually then the instructors tell me things like, see, input doesn't work. This communicative thing doesn't work because they're doing really bad on the test. And then the students tell me what? You're not teaching me. I need more grammar practice, which I don't blame them, right? I need to do well on the test. And then the other side, if the instruction is traditional, but the assessment is communicative, what happens is then the teachers say, oh my God, they can't say anything. They just didn't study. And then the students conclude what? I'm just bad at languages because I can't say anything. Right? The problem is that they have not been taught to be communicative. And so sometimes we need to be aware of why we're reaching certain conclusions if we don't first address this mismatch between instruction and assessment. So if we want to make proficiency-based happen, and that is a nod to the great book by Bill Van Patten, what we need to do is first, I would say you got to start changing the rubrics. You got to start with the grading. At least for college kids, that's what they care about the most, right? That's how they're measuring their success. And if the rubric is still about accuracy, then they're going to want the grammar practice, and they're going to, be thinking that you're counting errors, right, and all that. So I think we need to start by changing the rubrics to set clear expectations that way. And then, of course, we change the assessments, because if the rubric is no longer about how many words they can remember or how accurately they wrote something, then we start to realize this assessment and this rubric doesn't match, right? So we need to change the assessment, and then you change instructional practices. But what we see in a lot of higher ed is the opposite. We start by changing what happens in the classroom. And then we figure out maybe we need to change the test. But I think it needs to start the other way around, right? We need to start with the goal in mind first, and then we change instructional practices. And by the time you have changed the rubrics and you change the assessment, the change in instructional practices, which is the hardest, right? To change what you do every day, makes a lot more sense, because you're realizing I'm not helping them get to where they need to go, right? So then it makes it a little bit easier to change the instructional practices. So we need to start with assessment. The way that I do assessment is proficiency informed assessment of performance practice. Claudia Fernandez is about to have a stroke. Not practice, Claudia, you did not hear that. Proficiency informed assessment of performance. What does that mean? So performance is what we do in class, what we prepare them to do, right? So we ask them to do what we do in class. And then proficiency is what informs our goals and our targets, right? Our rubric. Okay? And the reason why I make this clarification is because if you are familiar with ACTFL, ACTFL makes this distinction, which we discuss in Common Ground, between proficiency and performance. And a lot of instructors come to me saying, I don't do proficiency because proficiency is impossible. Proficiency is the real world. They're going to do it later. That's not what I do. But when you really think about it, I don't even know why ACTFL started this distinction, because then everybody just got confused. To me, it's not necessary. They go hand in hand. The only difference is that, yes, we are in an instructional context. So we're going to be working towards something very instructionally, right, that we do in class, and let's see how well they can do it on their own, right? But it's still informed by proficiency. All the proficiency guidelines of what can a novice learner do, what can an intermediate learner, they're all there. Whether you're doing proficiency-based, performance-based, it's all there. Just the difference is that, of course, the assessments need to be very, very tied to what you've been talking about, right? You're not all of a sudden going to start doing an OPI on students, right? Nobody's saying that, right? But the guidelines are still informing our expectations. So one example, I don't have this one in Common Ground, so this is an extra. One example that I give for beginner level classrooms would be something like a culminating writing test. So this is where you start with this goal in mind almost from the get-go, right? So you know the students are going to be talking about themselves, their family, the hobby, the town, whatever. And so we're going to be building this email to the exchange student piece by piece throughout the semester, throughout the course, right? And so as you finish each unit and they're learning how to talk about all these things, they add a little section, they add a little paragraph to it, piece by piece. And it doesn't have to be just an email to an exchange student, but if you can find, connections across your units, not just we talk about something and forget, let's talk about something else, right? How can we be building towards one communicative task at the end? What I think helps with a lot is built-in revision for the students to be revisiting what they wrote before. And I'm guilty of this, right? The students turn things in, great, here's the grade. Then now, it fulfilled their destiny. We never look at it again, right? So how can we build something where they're looking back at it? And as their language develops, they can add to it, they can revise it. Of course, if you have a culminating task for the whole course, then the selection of content is going to be informed by that. It's not just because it's the chapter in the book, but rather it's because this is something that you would include in this email. So we need to learn how to talk about it. The most important one perhaps is that it reinforces this holistic view of language, right? That language is not just these islands of content and these islands of structures, but rather that we're all working towards being able to communicate this. And for novice level students, sometimes writing a longer piece of writing is daunting, right? So if you break it up and they work on it little by little throughout the course, as opposed to here's the unit, now write a paragraph. Right, there's more of it. Let's add to it a little more. Let's add to it next week. Let's add to it next week. Right, so you keep coming back to it. It helps also as well. The other example that I have is a culminating interview. So not oral, not a written task, but an oral task. This is something that I do with a course we have that is Spanish in the Professions. And in this course, so the culminating interview is going to be a mock interview, very low key. These are intermediate low students. For a volunteering opportunity. And so I need to ask them certain questions to determine which opportunity is the best for them. And so knowing that I'm going to be asking them all of this, right? I think of what are my units going to be, right? What is going to help them, but that by the end of the semester, they're able for, to have this conversation with me, that I can ask them things and then they can choose which opportunity is the best for them. And these examples are elaborated in much more detail in the fall 22 issue of the Language Educator, which is one of ACTFL's publications. Are you familiar with the Language Educator? Yes. Okay. So the article is called "The Missing Links: Cohesive Summative Assessments." If you are not an ACTFL member, you can still read it because it is the sample article for that issue. So it is available to everybody. You don't need to be an ACTFL member to read it. Okay, so when it comes to actually writing the rubrics, the things that I like to keep in mind are pretty simple. I'm very minimalist when it comes to rubrics. I am not a fan of the long rubrics with 10 million categories, and then at some point, I don't know what I'm evaluating anymore. So I try to keep it as simple as possible. And the three things that I look at is text type, function, and comprehensibility. And these are very, ACTFL words. So by text type, I mean that the student is mostly giving me single words or some phrases, as opposed to giving me pretty consistent sentences, or if I can say paragraphs, even more. Function, right? Are they able to provide the information I requested very minimally or more? Are they able to ask questions? Are they able to narrate, describe, depending on what level I'm targeting? Not first semester is going to be able to do all of this. This is informed by the proficiency guidelines. And then, of course, the last one is comprehensibility, which essentially can be understood by whom, which is an important piece of the puzzle, and to what extent. And for many of our students that tend to be intermediate or lower, it has to be understood by the instructor, right, who is familiar with how learners talk, right? That sometimes we understand a lot more that perhaps other people might. And then, of course, to what extent, right? Do I need to be asking for clarification or not? And you might be wondering, what about accuracy or language control? Because it is one of the factors that ACTFL also considers. And I think that accuracy and language control is important when we're talking about intermediate and up. But when we're talking about intermediate and lower, I don't want to muddy the waters with that, because they get so caught up in the form itself. And novice learners, there's only so much language control they're going to have, especially when we're talking about an oral task. If you look at how the performance descriptors are written for novice and intermediate, can you really tease apart language control and comprehensibility? Oh, that's funny. Somebody asked a question in the meeting. There we go. Let's talk about it. Is inaccuracy part of comprehensibility? Love it. We did not plan it, I promise. If you look at how it's written for the novice side, can control memorize language sufficiently to be appropriate and understood by those accustomed to it. How do I separate one from the other? Even intermediate. Control of language is sufficient to be understood. So to me, for novice and intermediate, it is very difficult to precisely pull apart their language control from the comprehensibility. When we're getting to intermediate, high and up, right, and especially the advanced, yes, I can see that because they're very comprehensible, but we need to be adjusting some of the forms, right? Some of the accuracy, the language control is not there yet. They're very, very comprehensible, right? So for a little bit, maybe intermediate and up, I would say, I see a reason for separated and in the rubric, but most of our students, especially in the, of course, the basic language program, are novice range, intermediate, low at most, right? So that's why I prefer not to introduce that language control, and especially because I want them to feel more comfortable taking risks, to knowing that I'm not counting their errors, right? And if that is not even in the rubric, it does magic to what they end up doing and how comfortable they end up feeling. And I'm not, you know, I don't have the quotes from the students here, but somebody asked me one time, well, but doesn't that make the students try less? You know, oh, they don't try as hard. No, I saw the exact opposite. They feel so comfortable trying more that it made quite a difference in how much they enjoy the class and how much they enjoy telling me things, because they knew I was not even looking at the conjugated, the verb, the gender agreement. I was not looking at any of that, right? I was just focusing on, can they communicate successfully at their level? As they progress, my expectations are going to get higher and higher, of course. But if I know that I'm dealing with novice level learners, I'm not counting errors, right? And this has to do with expectations of success, right? So I have to ask myself as I write the rubric, the highest point, what is successful performance at level? And for me, it has to be at level. And if you read chapter 2, you know why? For the mode, modality, and task conditions, right? And I have it in this lovely meme that people seem to like a lot. Okay, side story. I know we have to probably have lunch soon, but side story. I was at the ACTFL conference, right? Just walking around the exhibitor hall, and I see people with this meme printed on a t-shirt. They sent me a t-shirt. That was really nice. But yeah, so the reason why I say that is because at least in many languages, and definitely this is my level in Italian, I can understand a lot, right? I can read and understand. I can listen to somebody and understand quite a bit. If you ask me to write an email, okay, give me some time, and it may not look very pretty, but I can sort of do it. And my Italian friend says, let's chat, and all of the Italian goes out the window, and I can only say words. And I think that, I mean, this obviously makes a lot of sense, right? We know in language acquisition, comprehension always precedes production, right? So this is not surprising that a lot of our students sort of has this. But the reason why I say this is because what is successful performance? I'm not going to be expecting as much of that interview as I am of the written email, as I am of the read this and choose why and blah, 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 right? So my expectations have to be adjusted based on the task itself. It cannot be across the board for everybody, same task, same course, everything is intermediate. They're not. It's impossible for people to have the exact same proficiency level in all modalities and in all modes. It just doesn't work that way. And then Claudia, I'm glad you're there. So this is inspired by an analogy of Claudia Fernandez. Which birthday cake am I expecting? And so for me, oops, I touched the microphone, I'm sorry. For me, at level, right? So if I ask the students to bake a cake, I have to think about their expertise baking cakes, how much time they had, how many resources, flour, you know, what do they have to work with? I cannot be expecting this if they're novice, right? Everybody's going to be pretty much disappointed, right? So maybe I'm expecting this sort of a cupcake with some frosting, some M&Ms, beautiful, 100%, well done. Somebody added candles, oh, wow, you went above and beyond. But okay, maybe they're getting close, they put the candle next to it. So maybe revise and resubmit, add some frosting and put the candle on top, right? and the burnt brownie, we need to talk, right? What's going on here, right? But just for me to have realistic expectations, I cannot be expecting the beautifully decorated cake every time. And once again, some people say, but that's gonna make them not wanna try. And I have not seen that yet. I have not seen that yet. What I'm seeing is that if I'm aiming at this, only the 1 or 2 students who are like the overachievers are flying high, and everyone else is getting incredibly frustrated and don't want to study languages ever again. And they just burn the cake and walk out the room. Yes. So who am I teaching for? If somebody is already a pro and can give me that, okay, go ahead. Nothing's stopping you to go beyond, but I do not want to punish those who are trying their best and giving me some frosting, right? So for me, I have not found yet that aiming at level is detrimental for the students. I haven't found that yet. So from 1 to 5, do you agree or disagree with the statement? Expectations of success and progress in language classes are reasonable. Oh, I see a 1. Nobody wants to vote? Are you scared? What is reasonable? Well, you tell me. 3? Why did you say 1? Tell us.
Yeah, I mean, I just really agree with what you said, that the way we write rubrics is that the A is considered exceptional, and that for when someone is like doing, okay, which really I think is at level,
right?
That's considered like a B, maybe a B minus.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think that's definitely the case in a context like Cornell, where students are super, a lot of students are super overachievers.
Mm-hmm.
There is an expectation that that is basically like the baseline that students should be overachieving, and that is reasonable. But it's true that I see a ton of students who get super frustrated and they lose motivation.
They just want to give up, they check out.
And yeah, I mean, I just agree with that. That I think we have an expectation that students do actually much more than
that they can do, right? But yes.
Yeah, I showed 2 examples from the year before, so students can see what other students did and also see the variation between that and discuss it in advance.
I love that.
So that's much easier.
Yes. No, I love that for a lot of reasons. I do that too. I tell them, what does it, because I tell them, the expectation is intermediate low. What does that mean? What does somebody sound like when you're intermediate low in Spanish? They need to, because otherwise they don't understand our terminology. They don't understand the phrases and ask questions and text type and all of that. They just don't know that. And there's nothing wrong with that. They need to understand what it looks like, what it sounds like. Absolutely. I was thinking, this is obviously, open to interpretation here. I was thinking more in terms of, in general, in language classes, do instructors or curricula have realistic expectations? What I've seen a lot, and probably I'm guilty, not probably, I know I'm guilty of the same things, especially in terms of progress. It's a little bit faster than how acquisition works. Right, that we are like, we need to be done with this and moving on. We've done this with moving on. Even I know that we are expected to, every single course description is to aim for a different level, right? No one wants to tell the students, by the time you finish this course, you're going to be at the same proficiency level as what you started. We don't want to tell them that, right? So it's always like, but you know how hard it is to move from intermediate low to intermediate mid? It's not going to happen in 1 semester. So I think that sometimes they're not entirely reasonable for knowing how slow language acquisition, language development can be. I think that in some cases, people are making great progress, right, in changing their assessments, and then it seems much more reasonable. But it's just something to think about, right? How fast and how far we're pushing them. I see some comments, tend to expect progress always, different timing, okay. And then depend on students' acquisition. Yes. Okay, so with our realistic goal in mind, then we ask ourselves what language is useful or needed. And that is going to help us avoid the temptation of covering. which we're so used to. And in some cases, I know it may not be under your control, but I think it's so good if you can just stop thinking of what you're covering, and be perfectly okay with not introducing new structures. Textbooks are still written in this way, where every chapter has to introduce something new about the language. But there's nothing wrong with still using the same things we've been using. We're talking about new topics, so it's a different kind of progress, but you don't need to always be introducing new structures. And the analogy would be the analogy of a keyboard, right? So how do you use a keyboard? Do you ask yourself, what words can I write with these letters, or what letters do I need to write these words? Most likely you want to respond to an email. You don't say, "Oh, I want to use the letter J. What can I write?" No, you're like, "I want to type this word." So then you figure out what tools you're going to need for it, right? And Noonan, just to wrap up this part, said it beautiful with the organic metaphor for language acquisition. And it says, learners do not learn one thing perfectly, one item at a time, but numerous things simultaneously and imperfectly. These flowers, the linguistic flowers, do not all appear at the same time, nor do they all grow at the same rate. Some even appear to wilt for a time before renewing their growth. This is the beautifully frustrating thing about teaching language, right? Is that we have talked about this so much. I gave them so much input. We did so much in class. Where did it go, right? And it's because it's not so simple to say, okay, I got my goal. These are the tools they need. Voila. No, right? You may still get the burnt brownie. Okay, so the last part of my presentation is about principle-informed practices. I hope that we have enough time we have about 20 minutes? Okay, to go through it. And a lot of this, I think, is going to be revision of the basics of SLA, right? So the first thing, just as a reminder, right? These principles are not a magic formula for acquisition. Nobody has a magic formula. These principles just help us understand the why we do what we do, right? All we can do is increase the odds. What are those fundamentals? And this is all review from Common Ground. The first one is no input, no output. Everybody agrees with this. No one's going to argue, right? So if you never had any input in the target language, there's no way one day you wake up and start talking that language, right? So everybody agrees that input is necessary. Now, saying that input is necessary to me doesn't mean that output is unnecessary. We need to understand the roles that they play and why we may be doing different input-output activities at different levels. And then the last one that I think is a fundamental one to understand, and I think everybody can also agree with this, even the Kaiser, teaching rules is not a substitute for meaningful engagement with the language, right? So just because you explain that rule to somebody, that doesn't mean they will not need a lot of meaningful, purposeful input with that particular structure, right? It's that one doesn't replace the other. So when we think about the roles of input and output, if we simplify it a lot, right? Input helps to build the system and output helps to hone the skill of accessing the system. Now, there's a lot of overlap, right? It's not so clear-cut. It's not so one and the other completely separate from each other. They both do help to make and strengthen form meaning connections, which is essentially how acquisition happens. It's just that input is giving you that raw data, as BVP says, and output is helping you retrieve from your system. As you retrieve from the system, those connections keep getting stronger and stronger. So in a way, somebody argued with me one time, isn't that building the system because they're getting stronger? Okay, if you like that, yes. So just the basic difference is that obviously if there's nothing to retrieve because there was no input, there's not going to be any output. And another great quote from the great BVP, the initial stages of learning should be comprehension oriented. And I love that he says comprehension oriented, not exclusive. And then he added, however, a steady diet of comprehension only throughout one's language learning experience does not maximize acquisition, right? This is acknowledging something that we all know and nobody argues. This is not about input versus output, which team are you in? And we need, It shouldn't be about that. We all agree of the importance of input, the necessity for input. But we're not going to say that output is the evil twin of input, right? So that output is not necessarily a bad thing. That output can help with language development. So what are some qualities of input and output? Can anybody remember one quality of input and output? It needs to be comprehensible. There we go. It has to be meaningful, comprehensible. It carries meaning, not just symbols and sounds. It has to be compelling or purposeful. Compelling is a crashing word. If you don't like it, let's go with purposeful. And then the notion of the +1. And this, of course, gets debated and critiqued to death, because how do you quantify that +1, especially in a class of 20 students, right? Their +1 is going to look very differently. All it really is saying is that it has to be at the right level, roughly. It has to be an attainable challenge for the learner, right? And for some of them, it's going to be an easier challenge than for others, right? And that's okay, but it has to be attainable. It cannot be completely just sounds, completely just symbols, to the point that there's no way that they will understand this, right? That is just way too far. I don't think there's anything wrong with +0, right? That is, they understand everything. There's nothing wrong with that either, right? That can help you feel very confident about your skills. And then I think the comprehensible or meaningful, we all understand it. Let's unpack a little bit the second part, the compelling or purposeful. And I think that a lot of times there's a little bit of a debate here, because some purposes can be on the abstract side of it. Some purposes are very concrete. Something like entertainment, community building, they can be purposes, right? For language, for communication. And this is a little bit more along the lines of what Krashen was calling compelling, right? It's something that is inherently interesting to you, that you want to understand it just because you want to understand it. What my issue with it is that in a class of 20, I cannot find one thing that is inherently interesting to all 20 of them. So in some cases, they are going to be listening to me and be fascinated. And the other ones are daydreaming and they're not understanding anything. And they're not even telling me that they're not understanding anything. So I have to be realistic to what's happening in the classroom and how can I maximize that input I'm giving them and make sure that they're understanding. And this is where I go with more of the concrete purposes. They're going to have to do something concretely with that input, or even if it's their partner's output, I want them to do something with it, just to show me that they are understanding that language. You can call it extrinsic motivation, if you will. At the end of the day, I think that both in a way are about this need or accountability for paying attention to the message being conveyed. That's what I'm trying to do. And there's many creative and different ways that you can do that. But I try to build this in to make sure that everybody is paying attention to the message. What can they do? This list is in chapter 3. We don't have to go through all of it, but just as examples, right? So even if it's something like illustrating something, you need to show understanding. If it's matching, you need to do, right? So there's concrete things that they're doing to show me that they understood, right? Not that they need to be translating every sentence perfectly, because it's okay if they understand most of it to accomplish what I want them to accomplish. So the way that we have it in Common Ground, we have the first 2 questions, right? The what information is being conveyed, what will they do with the information? And we keep coming back to these questions over and over and over again for every activity, because to me that is so important that at least we have clear answers to these 2 things. What information is being conveyed? Because I don't want the answer to be irregular AR verbs. That's not information we convey. Okay? And then what will they do with the information? Is because if there's nothing to do with it, some students are going to pay attention to it, but most students are not. And then there's no way for me to know who understood or didn't understand. And then I added these 2 more recently, which is the could they do it without paying attention to meaning? Because you'd be surprised how many things can be done without paying attention to meaning that look like input or output, but there's no input or output happening. And then this is the art part of the science of teaching. Is it an achievable and enjoyable challenge? You know your students better than anybody, right? Just to give you an example, my students absolutely hate activities where they have to go around the room and ask questions or collect signatures or any of that. They dread it. Why would I do that to them? Right? It may work great in other classes. I don't know. It may check all the boxes, but the students do not enjoy it. So then why am I doing this? This is a little bit of more the personalized part of teaching. Okay, let's talk about input a little bit. The first thing I want to do is just clarify some misconceptions about input. The first one is to think that input is exposure. And you'd be surprised how many people think that input is exposure. It is not just exposure. If you're in front of the room just talking in the target language, but nobody's understanding anything, of course, that is exposure, but nobody is acquiring anything. It's not doing anything for the students. Learning about the language counts as input. That's not what we mean by input, right? So this is why one of the things I clarified was that teaching rules is not a substitute for meaningful engagement with the language, right? So just learning the rule doesn't count as input. And then another misconception, perhaps not as common, but wishful thinking, I guess, that understood or comprehended means acquired. Just because they can understand you, that doesn't mean that they have acquired and that they will now be able to use it productively. Woo, there's a big, big stretch between those two things. So let's look at this activity here. Students have to spot the differences between the two texts. They have to highlight them. Does it count as input? Can you do it even if you don't speak Spanish?
I was about to say, I can do this and my Spanish is very poor.
Right, so that is the big red flag, that this is contributing very little to it as it is. Can we modify it? Yes, but as it is, no. They can do it without paying any attention to meaning. What about this version of spotting the differences? You couldn't do it. Angelica, can you do it? Okay. That's the test. Always ask yourself, could Angelica do it?
That only counts for Spanish, though. Right? Give me that in German. I can probably do it.
Probably. I love that. Okay. So yeah. So in this case, you have to pay attention to meaning, right? You got to process that language for meaning in order to accomplish the task. So this is one way that there's a concrete something. And what information is being conveyed, the description of this painting, what do they have to do with it? They have to tell me if there's differences, right? We can then debate how enjoyable it is depending on your students, right? But I just wanted to show the difference, what I mean by spotting the differences, right? That this may look like input. Look how much contextualized language there is. But the students are not processing it for meaning. What about this one? You have a text, like an article, for example. There are some blanks. The students have to match the phrases there to the corresponding blank. Can you do it if you don't speak Spanish? You couldn't, right? So you have to understand in order to do it. This is one version of text reconstruction, right? And text reconstruction is great. It's a great way of engaging them with input. Just like you would tell them to put sentences in the right order, right? In logical order. They have to understand them to be able to put them. Same, just a different flavor of it, where they have to reconstruct this puzzle by putting the phrase in the right spot. And believe it or not, it is harder than it looks, because you really have to be paying attention to what the context of that paragraph and whether that phrase is going to go well there, right? Of course, you can make it as easy or difficult as you want, depending on your students. But I do this in my 300 level classes, content classes, right? But if we're going to read an article, this was about publicity in Spanish in the US. Let's make it a language activity too. You know what I mean? And let's do a text reconstruction. Why not? Those input activities are not just for beginning level, right? There's a lot that you can do in upper level as well. Okay, the second myth that we talked about is the understood is not acquired. I think this is probably not very shocking, right? But there's a whole lot that is happening between the students noticing language to actually being able to use it. And this is not linear, right? But this was Susan Gass's way of showing just how complicated it is, how much mileage, as she put it, there is between input and output. And this goes back to expectations of success and progress, right? How fast we're taking them from understanding a text to, okay, now you do it, right? And how long it's going to take them to be able to do that. To put it very simply, only a fraction of the input, right? So there's a lot, you're giving them a lot of comprehensible input. Only a fraction of that is processed. Only a fraction of that long-term memory is acquired, right? So we have to create the right conditions and also have the right expectations, right? Of how much is going in, so to speak. Now you're looking at this and maybe not feeling depressed by now, and changing careers. Or maybe you're wondering, couldn't we just teach the rule and skip ahead, right? Can we speed this up? And this goes back to the contrast between explicit and implicit knowledge, what we said at the beginning, that language teaching is different from teaching anything else, right? So knowing about the language versus using the language without necessarily verbalizing every rule that we're using. And if, and I'm gonna start with the same if that Savignon started with, if our goal is communication, then our goal is implicit knowledge. I'm using implicit knowledge to talk to you right now. There's no way that my brain could be explicitly conscious of every rule of the English language that I need to be able to tell you that. Impossible, right? I'm using my implicit knowledge. You're using your implicit knowledge to understand me. And that's what we want the students to do. If that's what we want, then our goal is implicit knowledge. And I don't think anybody says that being told a rule magically turns into implicit knowledge. Nobody argues that. We know this. We know this. Being told a rule does not magically turn into implicit knowledge. Even the people who say there may be connections between implicit and explicit, I don't think anybody is arguing that here's the rule, you got implicit knowledge. Nobody. So we still need to make a lot of room for that meaningful engagement with language, for them to build that system and being able to access and use their implicit knowledge. And Ellis said something that I think we all agree, that is, the process of learning a language would become impossible if every rule out of the thousands that comprise the grammar of a language had to be first learned as explicit knowledge, right? So instead of being so focused on teaching the rules and teaching about the language, we just need to shift our priorities, right? This is not about, there's no room for explicit knowledge ever. Of course, we use explicit knowledge right, when we're monitoring ourselves, editing, right? And it's self-correcting. I get all that. All we're saying is they had to be first learned as explicit knowledge, right? To curb our expectations of this teaching the rule and now you can use it, right? That sadly does not work that way. So nobody's saying we don't talk about grammar. This is the conclusion that some people seem to reach. That is not what we're saying. It is not what we're saying in SLA. It became this because people started associating grammar with drills, with just learning rules and practice and all of that. But actually, a lot of SLA scholars do embrace focus on form singular. And this was proposed by the great Michael Long, right? So where the communicative goal is supported, not subservient, to the forms. And we go back to the beginning. You have your communicative goal, how I'm going to get them there, right? The keyboard, right? What words do I want to type? And then I figure out what letters I use. As opposed to subservient would be, here are the letters, now write something. And I got to figure out, right? So I have to have my goals first, and then I figure out what support they need in terms of linguistic support. And of course, this attention to form needs to be realistic for their level. So even if you're like, what is a description? So they have to master ser and estar in Spanish. No, I mean, that's going to take a while. Right? It has to be realistic for their level. Focus on form is not about mastering every form. And focus on form can be intentional or incidental. I know I'm running out of time. I told you I would run out of time. So incidental would be things like when the learners initiate attention to form during a task. Nothing wrong with that. We don't need to be telling them, shh, we don't talk about grammar. It's not about that. They're focusing their attention. They want to know something. Nothing wrong with addressing that. The way we provide feedback is another form of focus on form singular. Including a written component is one way of promoting incidental focus on form. So for example, what Michael Long called bimodal input, that is oral and written at the same time. You hear it and you see it. They tend to focus more on what the language, those little parts of the language, right, than just oral, for example. Or even an activity like a dictogloss, and I show you an example in a minute. A dictogloss has been used a lot in interaction research. And essentially what a dictogloss is we're separating the dictation part and the writing part. So the dictation, the oral part is happening first, and then the writing part happens later. So you read the paragraph, whatever it is, a couple times, then the students try to reconstruct it from memory as best as they can. But it's impossible to reconstruct it just from memory. Inevitably, you start negotiating what the language probably looked like based on your knowledge of the language, right? And this is something that, again, is one of these techniques that is not exclusive to beginning language, right? Even as you progress and you have, and I do this also with advanced students, even in a conversation course, where it's like, let's say we're going to be talking about a short text, maybe it's a noun, maybe it's a description of something, right? We're going to do it as a dictogloss first to help them focus on some of that language. And then we're going to keep using the text and talking and everything, right? So there's always ways of incorporating some of these techniques. The variation that you can do for the novice level students, for example, oh, this is, I'm sorry, there's a typo here. The first part is not right, I'm sorry. The first part is just that you provide a version of the text with some of the blanks. And then the students need to be reconstructing these blanks based on the text you use. So essentially, it's the same as the dictogloss, but you're helping them out by giving them some parts of that text, so they don't have to remember all of it. When it comes to intentional focus on form, and then we can wrap it up from here, it has to be relevant to the communicative goal. I'm going to say that until I'm blue in the face. You have to be aware of cognitive overload and processing, and this is the legacy of the Gray-Bilbin pattern. And of course, you have to be aware of what forms are prevalent. For example, if most of the input is in third person, don't get frustrated if then they're using third person to talk about themselves. Most of the input was in third person, right? If most of the input is in masculine form in Spanish, don't be surprised that the students are using mostly masculine forms, right? So you have to be aware of some of those things in the input as well, and how much they're affecting processing. Okay, one example and then I'm done, I promise. So just even in how we construct the activities, right, of pushing the students to process certain forms. If you compare these two activities, there's one very, very subtle difference, and it makes all the difference in how much they're processing language. What do you notice between version A and version B? Yes, but what do you notice in terms of how it's structured? Yeah.
2 and 3 in each one. In the first one, you don't provide any indication that it's plural, and in the second one, it tells you with the and that there are two subjects.
Right. So if you were a student, in which of the two examples would you need to be paying more attention to the language? The first one, because I'm not giving you any hints as to whether I'm expecting one name or more than one name. The only way you know if I'm expecting one name or more than one name is by looking at that little ending that tends to be ignored a lot, right? So even something as subtle as that, we need to think about how much we're giving it away versus having them work for it. Some students are going to notice it right away and do great. And some students are going to fall for it and put one name. And that's where we do our attention to form feedback. And then they get that cognitive challenge of, wait, why not? Wait, what? And they notice the process, that verb ending. Okay, so even things like that we can keep in mind, you know, when we're doing activities. This is not going to work for every single part of language, right? So I understand that, but at least just think about how much you're giving away as opposed to pushing them to pay a little bit more attention to process in the context of something communicative. We're getting to know each other, right? So it doesn't have to be always an isolated drill, that there's ways of building in attention to form. Okay, I had a lot more planned, but we're not going to get to it. So I'll end here, but I thank you all very, very much. And we'll get to the thank you slide so you see who I am. All right, thank you all so much. I really, really appreciate it. And we're going to be hanging out for lunch, right? So if you have questions, I'm happy to talk.
Well, thank you, Florencia. This was wonderful. Lots of food for thought here. Things for us to process the input you gave us, right? Hopefully it wasn't too far beyond I+1.
It was comprehensible.
It was, yeah, I would say so. Absolutely. So thank you all for joining today. Thank you also to everybody on Zoom land, and to be mindful of the time. We will wrap up the Zoom meeting, but as Florencia said, we are here for a little while longer. Lunch is ready outside. So please take the time to ask any open questions of Florencia. Thank you again, Florencia.
Thank you.
This was wonderful, and guten Appetit here in a hot second.